taking it down.
That's great.
I honestly never put it up. It sounds like I'm making that up, but I had nothing to do with it. So
It's an honor bestowed upon you.
I guess the big honor will come in August of next year when I retire.
Ah, that's wonderful.
Yeah, 36 years is enough.
And Marianne, I think we met through Todd Stein.
Yes.
How do you do?
Yeah, it's nice. It's nice to meet you. And we've just sent out an email to Todd asking him if he'd like to come and talk to the Preservation Commission. So hopefully we can get some momentum going for a Main Street interest.
That's great, because that's something that we've been interested in. We offered to host an event at his bank and inviting all the property owners.
Right. Summertime in East Aurora, our commission just sort of shuts down. So now we're back up and going again.
Good to hear. And I think he's the first one in New York State to take advantage of the new 50% state historic and federal tax credit combination.
It's 50%. Okay, I'm not aware of that part. Okay.
Yes. So I think he's the first project in the state eligible for that.
Okay. Yeah, that's something how do I want to put this? The difficulties we've had in East Aurora is something that I'll talk about.
Okay.
So.
And Christiana is someone I miss seeing since our office moved out of her building. We don't get to see her anymore. She's such a bright and cheerful presence.
Thank you, Clinton. We stole the plants that you guys had up there. We moved them down to our level because the owners certainly weren't watering them. So we took them over.
Thank you so much for doing that.
How's the new spot? Is that what I'm seeing behind you, or is that your house? I don't mean to be nosy, but how's the new office shaping up?
Well, the house and the office are sometimes one continuum, but this is the office.
Nice.
And we're trying to make our office both comfortable residentially and progressive because we practice progressive historic preservation.
Yeah,
so.
Excellent.
But we do miss that, you guys, and we miss Bill and all the other folks who helped make Market Arcade happen.
It's all nice. It's all quiet now.
I don't know if you've met Greg Pinto. He's with Clinton Brown Company Architecture, a Fredonia graduate, University of Buffalo graduate, and former member of the Amherst Historic Preservation Commission Advisory Committee, and is now working under Ellen and Mary's leadership on a potential historic district in Jamestown.
Yes, the new one.
So he's the next generation, Greg.
Very exciting.
All right, well, I will jump in here and we can return to all of this after the formal things otherwise. But thanks everybody for convening this evening. John Lemoncuso had to withdraw this evening. His son has football practice, unfortunately. So that'll just change our order ever so slightly with his absence. And, I don't see any reason in delaying what we're here for. So I want to invite us to kind of just kick things off. Greg, I have you presenting your thoughts first. So if you want to introduce yourself for anyone who may not be familiar with you, and you can take it away.
Yeah, thank you, Ellen. First, let me apologize for my voice. I've had a really rough allergy season beginning last week, and my voice is now coming back, but I still sometimes break out in cough. So from time to time, I'll probably mute myself. My name is Greg Rabb, JCC Faculty 1, professor of political science and law here at your Jamestown Community College for 36 years and involved in just about every aspect of city government and state government and federal government for, well, at least 22 years, maybe even longer. I know we only have about 7 minutes apiece, so I will try to keep my eye on the time and realize that if you let a professor talk and somebody who went to law school, you probably, and a someone who's still very active in politics, you probably can't shut me up, but I'll shut myself up. So, I've been a preservationist all of my life. I can still remember when I was in high school at Canisius High School, because I grew up in Buffalo, I sent a $5 check to the restoration of the Wilcox Mansion over on Delaware Avenue, where President Roosevelt was inaugurated. And that sparked my long-term interest. Now, I'm not going to take you through my entire life, because then we wouldn't get anything done. But when I started to work on my master's degree in urban planning at the University of Illinois, one of the opportunities I had was to study with now the late Professor Lachlan Blair. And everything I knew about historic preservation, my foundation was from him. I took his classes, but I was also his assistant in both teaching and research. And he was the historic preservation at the University of Illinois. And he taught me a lot of different things, which I think I like to believe that I carried on through my life. And at one point in my career, before I turned to full-time teaching, I became the first executive director of the West Side Neighborhood Housing Services on Buffalo. I started that agency on Connecticut Street in an area rich in historic structures. And what I remember most about that with the NHS model is that we were the only one of the 6 NHSs to have a grant from the National Trust for Historic Preservation to make loans to properties that were considered historic, which I had to basically steal from City Hall because they had a complete record and they weren't going to give it to me. But I went in there and pretended to be an employee and purloined it. I guess I can admit that now. And then because of my success with preservation there, I moved on to being the first executive director of the Providence Preservation Society and Revolving Loan Fund in Rhode Island, and worked there, started that up, and then went to law school. And then the rest is somewhat history. But while I was studying, learning, and doing this, one of the major projects here in Jamestown that I was associated with was the restoration of the 1931 Erie Railroad Station in downtown Jamestown, which is a gorgeous building and is now the centerpiece of the National Comedy Center. And I still remember how difficult that project was, going through it as a member of the Urban Renewal Agency, a city councilman, walking through that building, stepping over puddles and seeing the water come through the roof. And, you walk through there and thought, my God, we'll never be able to restore this. Well, I think about $10 million later, if I remember the figure correctly, and many battles with the State Historic Preservation Office. Fortunately, you can go downtown and view certainly the exterior of the building, and it's worth going into the gift shop just to see that beautiful lobby that prior to it becoming the Comedy Center, I performed multiple marriages there as a city marriage officer. It was a lovely setting. Now it's a gift shop, so I guess commerce took over. But I relate all that as quickly as I can just to point out that I consider myself a preservationist. But one of the things I learned from Professor Blair was several things. One is you can't save everything. At some point, you have to establish priorities. Some things may not be worth saving for lots of different reasons, not necessarily historically or culturally, but maybe the amount of money that it's going to take to do it in the long run may not be in the best interest of the community. And so because I was running the West Side NHS and we had the principle that the office should be in the neighborhood, with the board of directors dominated by the neighborhood, it was my job doing code enforcement to also convince homeowners, well, look, you've got a beautiful structure here and it's historically lovely and important, and the value of that building is keeping it the way it is. So you got to fix the codes, but we can give you a loan interest loan to do some stuff that maybe otherwise you couldn't do. And when I return to Buffalo from time to time, because I still do work for Buffalo State, my old neighborhood, as I like to call it, is doing actually quite well. And while I was working there, I lived in Allentown in a historic house. And since I moved to Jamestown, I also own a historic house. I've got a document from the Fenton History Center identifying my house as being built in 1875 by someone who ran one of the street railway companies. And the house is basically sound, but I've been there, oh gosh, I forget how long now, maybe a quarter of a century. And one of the struggles for me as a middle income homeowner is trying to keep that home up and needing financing more than I need tax credits. And so one of the other principles I believe in is that you need to, especially with residential property, and in Lakeview, you can't convert these houses back. Well, you can't convert them into apartments, but my house is huge and probably way too big for me. But the expense of maintaining it is challenging. And I know now that I'm going into retirement, I may actually have to leave the house, even though I don't want to, because some of those big old houses on Lakeview and some of my neighbors are struggling because except for one or two people, nobody even has the income that can take advantage of the tax credits. And so one of my principles is that before we talk about an ordinance, we have to talk about a historic preservation policy, because I think of the ordinance as a tool, an important tool, just like I think of the tax credits as a tool, or the low interest financing that I was able to offer through Westside NHS. So I think one of the things we don't have, and I appreciate all the work that folks have done, especially with trying to inventory properties, which includes mine, but I don't think at this point we have a policy about preservation. And a policy and an ordinance all has to go through the Planning Commission, of which I still have the pleasure of chairing it through the end of the next year, 2022. So there goes my voice. I would like to see us develop a policy that looks at multiple tools that can be used. And if we're going to do an ordinance on Lakeview Avenue, one of my concerns is, we don't really have a problem with gentrification in Jamestown. I often joke that that's a problem I'd like to have. But right now, my street is very diverse. And I know of two properties that I think took advantage of the tax credit, and then the owners sold them, and people came in and started to change the neighborhood. So, neighborhood change is inevitable, but I love my old neighborhood, and I want to make sure that if we do anything with preservation, that at the base of it constantly is those of us who live there, have invested in there like I have all these years, have paid the taxes. And so we are key to that. And preservation is more about buildings. It's about people and the people who live there. So that's the sermon according to Father Rab. And I think, I was a good Jesuit educated boy and man. And so, I think I got it within about 7 minutes. So I will conclude with that. And thank you for listening to me. And I will probably mute so you don't have to hear my cough. But thank you.
Thanks, Greg. Great. All right, I'm going to move to Michelle, actually, since Anne is not with us this evening. So Michelle, if you want to introduce yourself, and you can, again, take it away.
Hi, so I am Michelle Paternity. I'm an interior designer. I have my own design business, Michelle Paternity Design. I've been doing it for about 25 years. I have always had a passion for preservation and historical buildings and preserving them. This is actually, besides my own personal home and with my clientele, this is my first time really delving into this and being on a roundtable or like a committee. So I'm super, super excited. I don't have any of Greg's experience except for interior design and architecture. I did study it in college, but it's something that I do with all my clients. I'm very big into sustainable design. So this falls into that category. So So this is going to be for me way under 7 minutes, and it's going to be a learning tool for me and how to step into the community and help out in the community and help to grow our area in a different way. And I have similar belief systems that that Greg does about when to choose. Like, you can't save every building, like he said, and I do truly believe in that. I believe in really researching and every aspect of a building or the area or the neighborhood to make sure that it is the right decision. And I'm excited about being here, and I really I hope that I have something to offer to the group. So thank you.
Great, thanks, Michelle. Yeah, I'm excited too. So it's nice to have fresh voices.
Thank you.
Whether it's round or virtual. So
Right.
Yep. We're moving on. I actually forget who I had put next, whether it was Marianne or Mary.
I think it's Marianne.
All right, take it away,
Okay.
Marianne.
Okay. My name is Marianne Collopy, and my interest in historic preservation actually comes through history. We bought our first house for $8,500 in the Black Rock neighborhood of Buffalo. And then we sold it 6 years later for the grand total of $24,000. So we've been doing this a long time. I have lived in New York, New Jersey, and Puerto Rico, and have seen a lot of different structures. I have been a National Park Service ranger over in the Hudson Valley at the home of Franklin Roosevelt, and my graduate studies are in public history. So besides being interested in preserving buildings, I'm interested in preserving material culture. At one point, I also did some work for an engineering firm doing Section 106 work after Hurricane Sandy. And when you talk about the nitty-gritty practicalities of preservation, the 106 work is definitely that. There's a lot of stakeholders, and there's a lot of hard practicalities and politics involved in that. Currently, we live in East Aurora. Our house is a 1928 Dutch colonial, part of the expansion that happened in East Aurora because of the Roycroft success. The village grew quite a bit. That house we bought for $8,500 in Black Rock was probably built about 1910. Then we lived in North Buffalo in a beautiful 1901 center entrance colonial. And in New Jersey, it was awful 1980s housing. Living in East Aurora, people will say, you know, we like our town, we like our village, we like everything that is old. However, they also say, I don't want anybody telling me what to do. As chair of the Historic Preservation Commission, about 4 or 5 years ago, we tried to encourage interest in a local preservation district on the east end of Main Street. Typical large Victorian homes on large plots of land. We had a meeting, everybody seemed very on board. By the next meeting, we had someone who had looked very carefully at our ordinance and realized that there was the possibility of jail time if there were successive violations of the preservation ordinance. And that absolutely killed any thoughts of having a preservation district. Since that time, I've become chair. We've tabled the idea of the East Aurora or the East End Historic District, and we have rewritten our preservation code. We basically based it off the New York State model law, and it's currently, the village passed it. Now it's in Albany being looked at by SHPO. People will say that they know how to take care of their houses, and they think they know what they are doing. And I think it's important for us to somehow show that we have expertise. And I mean, I've literally had PhDs say, I'm educated, I know what I'm doing, you know, and for us to be able to say, well, okay, You may be a systems engineer over at Moog, but I'm the historic preservationist, and this is my area of expertise, and I know what I'm doing also. The other thing I'd like to point out is you really need to have all members of your local government on board. East Aurora is fortunate in that the housing stock is relatively untouched, but it also is old. We have several national historic landmarks, one of which is the Roycroft campus. Part of the Roycroft campus is in private ownership. For 20 years, there has been a property that is deteriorating on the Roycroft campus. And the code enforcement officer has had a soft approach, talking with the guy, having coffee with the guy. It took 15 years to finally bring an action, and he was slapped with a $25 fine. It's 5 years after that. We have a new code enforcement officer, but now we have a court backup, so they don't know when it's going to come. But if your code enforcement officer is not willing to enforce the code, you are stuck. There is nothing you can do. And I think that was the biggest eye opener for me, is how much depends on everybody in the local government having the same agenda. I don't know, what else can I tell you? Coming at this from a museum background, when you talk about there are things that you have to save, there are also choices in the way you save things. And I think that's very important to realize too. You don't have to build everything exactly as they did in the past. Things above the second floor, you can fudge. And I think that's important to let people know, is that we're not anti-new materials, we're not anti-profit, and we need to work with people. But as said earlier too, the tax credits benefit businesses. They don't necessarily benefit private homeowners. The gentleman I talked about with his building being deteriorating for 20 years, we don't know what is going to happen with that. He does not have the wherewithal to fix it. At this point, we don't know who would want to buy it and fix it. And I'm afraid it's going to be, and we really think it's going to be demolished. So that's our story.
Marianne, I'm sure we'll be circling back. So
okay,
that bubbles up there. Yeah, thank you. All right, Miss Mary Maxwell.
Mary Maxwell. I work for the Jamestown Renaissance Corporation, which was developed in 2006 to help the city work through some grants that they needed some help with. I am a transplant. I came here in 1985. When I go home, they can't understand a damn word I'm saying anymore, and I have to write the words down so they can figure it out. I grew up in a very historic family, very interested in history. And I'm going to tell you guys this. I don't tell everybody this but I think you might appreciate it. The farm I grew up on, the farm my father owns, actually had the only privately owned Civil War fort, Southern fort on the land, and he owned it. And there was always talk that when the Union soldiers came in North Carolina, Sherman came up the coast, but when they came in, they knew they were coming. There was never a battle, but they took all the guns, the cannons, and threw them over the cliff in the river. And all the old people told us about it, but And when I was 16, a salvage company came and pulled out 12 of the original guns. And it's the only Civil War fort that has their original guns that were lost and came back. So I got into history real early and ended up majoring in history, and have done many different things and have many different skills, and I can do a little bit of everything. And I started working for the Renaissance in 2013. I am now the history person here because I'm the only one that has stayed long enough. And now they come to me and say, do you remember when we did this? So I have to keep taking notes so I can remember what's happening. So I was involved. I was not involved with the downtown development of the historic district, but I keep the figures. I did come in halfway with the Lakeview. And I was helped a great deal with SHPO getting the Forest Heights up last year in October. So I happen to know, I have the figures here. So far, there's been $27 million reinvested in Jamestown using the tax credits. And in Lakeview, Greg, there were 5 houses that have used it, and it's $88,000. And I don't think all of them have moved. I think one of them maybe sold their house and moved. What do I think about the Jamestown building stock? One thing we need to do, we're working on a 1993 historic survey. We need to update that. It's time. We're still using it. I sent Greg some stuff today, but we really need to put some money in that and update it. What do I think about the LPO? Well, I think we need some kind of boundaries, standards, guidelines. I don't care if it's an ordinance, a policy, or a code. I just think there's got to be somebody to say, you can't paint your historic house Pepsi blue with pink shutters. Somebody has to say, no, that's not what we're trying to do here. I don't know how you do that, but that's what I think.
Thanks, Mary. My favorite example of yours is the polka dot house.
Somebody paint their house in Wonder Bread polka dot. They can do that. There's nobody,
Right.
there's
Right,
nothing
they can do
stopping
that.
anybody from doing it.
Right? No design guidelines for them to
Right. I mean, if you know, and if you're in a historic area and your next door neighbor is really into it and trying to sell their house or something, I don't want to see somebody put a gazebo on a cottage house. You know, you have to stay within some kind of guidelines.
All right, thank you. I believe we're moving on to Clinton.
Very good, thank you. Thank you. First of all, to the mayor, Crystal and Ellen, for the opportunity to be here. We spent a lot of time in Jamestown over the years, going back to when Jack Quinn was the first congressman, first became congressman, and we have had some impact, and then the momentum shifted to planning, and now we're so happy to be back under this new, fresh leadership, and probably more brain power than most communities have anywhere in upstate New York. And I'm so pleased that you started the conversation with the website, Ellen. That's a great place to start developing a policy with what are the facts. And so thank you for the opportunity to be here. I'm an architect. Clinton Brown Company Architecture specializes in historic preservation, architecture, and grants services. From the very start, we had to find the money to get hired to do what we wanted to do, because the only people interested in historic preservation were people with no money. So we've helped our clients raise almost $38 million for their preservation projects. That's not counting historic tax credits. We may be the leader in historic tax credits for residential work. And I'm also an active citizen in public policy and advocacy at all levels. My experience in preservation started from the cradle, basically, when my grandmother and mother taught me about the Niagara River region, and our family's been here a long, long time. So there are a lot of places where we've made an impact, and that certainly affected me. I grew up next to the Niagara Brower project when it was being built. My grandfather conceived that over 100 years ago. And then subsequently in high school, college, and university, I had the very good fortune to be educated by some of the best people available at the time, including Austin Fox in high school, who created the Buffalo Preservation Movement with others. And meanwhile, I've been practicing 40 years, and it's continuing education experience and active with advocacy. I just got off a national Zoom with people from Preservation Action, talking about the agenda of preservation in Washington. My relationship has been to play nearly every role in historic preservation. As a supporter, critic, student, and teacher. I was the secretary of the Buffalo Preservation Board and wrote most of its current ordinance. created historic districts, wrote Buffalo's only design guidelines for the Joseph Ellicott District, and also wrote the only city preservation plan that's ever been created in Buffalo with John Conlon. There's a copy of it in some box here in the office. The governor appointed me to the Richardson Center Corporation that is in charge of rehabilitating the Richardson Olmsted Complex, 500,000 square feet of completely obsolete but lovely, amazingly beautiful buildings. And successive secretaries of the Interior over the past 16 years have appointed me a commissioner of the Erie Canalway National Heritage Corridor Commission, which has a statewide influence. Finally, I'm a director of the Willowbank School of Restoration Arts in Queenston, Ontario. And people associated with Willowbank have created the preservation policy statements produced by UNESCO and used worldwide. So that's an international perspective that shows how far behind we are as a country and a culture in understanding how to deal with what everyone else calls heritage conservation. And heritage preservation, which if you Google preservation, you get pictures of jams and jellies. Conservation is a whole different concept, and I think that's so important for what we're thinking about. Jamestown's building stock is like corn in Iowa and pigs in Nebraska, or wherever they have corn and pigs. It is our treasure throughout upstate New York, as well as Jamestown, that we have this magnificent inheritance built by our ancestors with less resources and more practicality, and yet clear values that these buildings embody. And so what to do with it, I think this has been mentioned before, is that a citywide survey is one tool for enacting the preservation policy that Greg was mentioning. That's knowing what you have. And the second aspect of it is what I see as conservation, and that is prioritizing saving structures and prioritizing demolishing structures. Every single council member in every city in upstate New York's number one call from constituents is the blighting house on their block. They want it demolished, and they don't see an alternative. And it's taken, particularly Preservation Buffalo Niagara has been the most effective organization at this. It's taken decades to educate elected officials that there are alternatives, and historic preservation through an ordinance is one of them. And I have to compliment Preservation Buffalo Niagara for achieving what so many of us have tried to achieve for 40 years. They really are making it happen. And it is that convincing the elected officials that this is a tool. From the business side, one of the reasons that Buffalo is doing so well is Stan Lipsey, the publisher of the Buffalo News, realizing that reinvesting in our inheritance was smart business. Few communities have anybody like Stan Lipsey, but Buffalo did, and we really rose head and shoulders above all the others because he was able to make the business case to his fellow business leaders that preservation was the way to go. I think the local preservation ordinance is an absolutely necessary thing to do. It benefits Jamestown by putting the public more in charge of the process of new investment and change, making positive changes to their neighborhoods and reducing negative impact. And part of the reason is that as cities densify, for the first time in human history right now, most people live in a city. There needs to be growth and investment and change. However, planning boards and zoning boards are not up to the task. Planning is not up to the task of identifying and retaining community character. They just don't have the tools. Only historic preservation or heritage conservation has the tools. And there is the opportunity to reward from the age of the housing stock. That means you have money in the bank already, you just need to put it to work. So the benefit of doing that through local designation is that you retain and enhance property values and city property tax income. I learned this from a very conservative Republican mayor of a small city. He said, he figured out, so if I have local preservation districts that protect and enhance property value, I have more tax income to pay my police and fire. And that's what I learned is most effective in working with elected officials, because they're all faced in upstate New York with huge bills and low income to pay those bills for essential services that deserve to be paid well. And the reason that is true is that the local review of designated properties causes people to measure twice before cutting once. A very fundamental principle. You measure twice before cutting once. And just to speak to Marianne's comment, we've created probably more historic districts than anybody. We have found there's always the argument of someone's telling me what to do, and that's in my downside. It will hurt Jamestown by City Hall. Ugh. The answer is so often those are the same people who call you after the National Register Historic District has been put into place, which is benign, and say, my neighbor is wrecking their house and impacting mine. How do I stop them? I said, well, we told you, if you had a local historic district, you'd have some power over what happens in your neighborhood when something meets planning and zoning requirements, but doesn't meet community character requirements. So oftentimes those people who don't want to be told to do are the first who want to tell someone else to do and are looking for a local district to have that power over their own neighborhood. That's the big plus. Another downside is that too often preservation does not have a seat at the table. Commissions are understaffed, underqualified, and they have unfair preservation board people and processes. In creating one of America's largest historic districts in Buffalo, the Elmwood District, National Register level, the number one obstacle was the fear it would become a local district, because everybody knows how badly Allentown's been treated by the Preservation Board over the years. The Preservation Board is the best it's been in my lifetime since I left it. It was very good in terms of its original founders because, like you, Greg, they knew their authority, responsibility, and values of your generation, my generation, and that wasn't always the case. So the biggest obstacle was the bad reputation that the local preservation board had with the local historic districts. There's a lot of uncertainty about historic designation because we don't do enough education, and Preservation Buffalo Niagara, Explore Buffalo, and other entities are beginning to solve that. But we too often have people who buy a house without knowing that it comes with the review of a local designation, and they're surprised and upset, and there's no mechanism to tell them that because it's not necessarily registered with a deed. And then finally, fossilization. Right now, there is a backlash in the historic preservation community that that restoration is the only approach. And I am a big tent, old time liberal that you need to renew a historic district. We have people in the Elmwood area upset that places that are deteriorated are being demolished, but in almost every instance without preservation board review currently, the new is better than the one that place that got it replaced. And so there has to be this notion of fossilization is happening at the State Historic Preservation Office. It's happening at the National Park Service, and it's trickling down. Preservation standard number 9 used to require contemporary architecture to be contemporary, and that contemporary additions to historic buildings be identifiable as contemporary. But right now, this fossilization approach is really killing the movement in a way that's very unfortunate. In terms of the details, I've read the ordinance. There's one detail I want to point out on page 6. Under administrative reviews, number 4, the Common Council may allow the Preservation Board to designate. I don't think preservation boards should designate. Designation, in my view, and the Secretary of Interior's view, should always be in the purview of elected officials who are answerable to people. And so I would carefully look at that language and consider taking out the authority of the board acting without oversight of elected officials to designate. So that's one detail. Finally, in terms of, Ellen, you're asking anything else? Put me in, coach. I'm ready to play. I think this is so great. This is such an exciting time for Jamestown. It has really got great young new leadership that is going to do great things and put the city on the map in a really positive way for a long time to come. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Clinton. All right, we're going to move right on to Christiana.
Hi, everybody. I am Christiana Limniadis. I'm the Director of Preservation Services for Preservation Buffalo Niagara. I am a historic preservationist. I've been working professionally in the field for just hit my 15-year mark. Right out of undergrad, I started working for Historic Albany Foundation in our capital in Albany. After a couple of years there, I went off to Cornell University and completed my master's coursework towards a MA in Historic Preservation Planning. And since then, I've been working in nonprofit preservation advocacy or in consulting in Louisiana, Tennessee, and then back here in home state of New York. I've been with Preservation Buffalo Niagara since 2017. We are the region's only full service, professionally staffed preservation organization. I say region because while our name has Buffalo and Niagara in the title, we actually provide services to the 5 westernmost counties of New York State. So we are here, like Clinton just said, throw me in, coach, like PBN is here to help you in Jamestown, all of Chautauqua County with any sort of preservation projects that you have. I'm obviously a staunch historic preservationist. While I do love pretty old buildings and learning the history about them, the reason I am a preservationist is because I strongly believe that preservation is an incredible, powerful tool and vital tool to creating more culturally rich, affordable, and sustainable communities. There is this misconception out there that all preservationists want things to look old-timey, to keep things in the past, to make people live in historic house museum type environments. And that is just, in my opinion, not what the modern preservation movement is about. Preservation is a way to manage change. It's about prioritizing reusing our existing fabric to create that more sustainable, authentic future. But as Clinton and other people have mentioned, we can't keep every single building. That's just not possible. Buildings have lifespans. So in that umbrella of preservation, we can then create much more informed and smart decisions for how we create that new built environment by learning and listening to that building we had to get rid of and the buildings that we had in the past. So it's not just about freezing us in this little museum of old buildings. It's about reusing as much as we can and using that information and knowledge to create better buildings for us into the future. On my thoughts of the Jamestown building stock, yes, Jamestown should be saving and prioritizing reusing over demolitions. Compared to other communities of similar age and building stock, you have definitely fared much better. You look at comparable cities, 19th century industrial boom towns like Jamestown, and you see in the dark times of the 50s, 60s, and 70s, they thought the only way to combat the issues was through wholesale demolition. They bought into that predatory developer myth that you need to have ready to build vacant spots to attract investment and to develop your way out of your economic issues. Demo it and they will come. And we literally have decades worth of data and example cities that show that that mentality does not provide results. You cannot demo your way to community growth. You cannot only demo your way to community growth. And again, by putting this lens of preservation, we're able to look at much more things while we're evaluating what to do with these buildings than to just simply say, do we get rid of it or do we not get rid of it? To the LPO itself, it will most definitely benefit Jamestown. There is not enough time tonight to list out all the ways that it could benefit Jamestown. If you go to PBN's YouTube page, you'll see different workshops where I explain in great detail all of the benefits of various of LPOs. So definitely there's lots to talk about that. But I want to just talk about two really key benefits of it. First is by providing that additional review to evaluate changes to the historic built environment. By having that chance to utilize preservation standards and guidelines, you have the opportunity to evaluate more than just those very specific factors that are considered by a planning board or a zoning board. Essentially, the review done by a preservation commission allows for a much more holistic approach to the review. And Clinton was kind of touching on that already, to factor in not just what the proposed changes are to that building and how it would impact that individual resource, but it also how the community utilizes and interacts with that resource and how those changes would affect the community's use of that building and that area, that part of the neighborhood. It also evaluates how those proposed changes would impact the surrounding environment. So again, it's not a simple checkbox that the planning or zoning board would be able that uses. It's much more looking at the bigger picture of what is this resource? What is our goal with this building? How do we get there with the best path forward that benefits the property owner, the building, and the community together? Somebody mentioned, I forget who, and I was writing down my note really quickly, but somebody was talking about protecting investments. LPOs protect investments. Again, because of that extra review, and you're not just looking at very specific limited check boxes that a planning board, a zoning board, or a code enforcement officer would be looking at. You're looking at much more factors that go into that building and that project. And so you're able to protect or attempt to protect the investment of that property owner and the building in question, protect the investment of the neighbor next door. Without this extra review, you could have someone buy the house next door to you, demolish it, and build a huge apartment building because planning and zoning allowed for that, but you live in a very small one-story neighborhood. And so the preservation review allows that protection for everyone's investment. The last benefit I want to mention is kind of this passive economic development that comes from having a quality building stock. And you have a quality building stock by protecting that quality building stock. Yes, there is heritage tourism and, Jamestown with the Comedy Museum. Obviously, you guys understand how that works and creating these things to attract people to come to your community. But there's also historic tax credits. There's been some very strong opinions about tax credits that, again, I would argue with you if we had more time about and get into the weeds on why I don't see that those limitations that were pointed out are actual limitations. But there are also developers who are purposefully going to small communities, just like Jamestown, like Buffalo, like Niagara Falls, purposely to pick up fabulous historic buildings at a cheap price so they can utilize those historic tax credits, improve that building, create a positive benefit on that community, but at the same time, put a nice little check in their pocket because they've been able to leverage that financial incentive to fix that building and to get them to their financial desires and get them that price point that they want on that project. Again, there are developers who are coming to Buffalo and Niagara Falls specifically to do those types of projects. Jamestown could be that as well. But again, without that protection of the LPO, you have developers who are not willing to make that or nervous about making that financial investment because that investment won't be protected. The other thing that we have to talk about, because it just finished happening here in the city of Buffalo, is this, in booming film industry that is happening here. And the number one reason why Buffalo is becoming, Western New York is becoming the center for that type of industry is because of our building stock. The film that just recently wrapped, it was called Cabrini. I'm reading my notes now. They filmed 37 locations in 45 days. Almost every single one of those locations was a historic building, designated and not designated, but they were historic structures. They paid money to the city and those private owners to be able to film at those locations. More than 85% of the crew working on those films and the extras were local hires. They estimated that 70% of the $30 million budget on that film was spent in the city of Buffalo and the surrounding communities that they filmed in. That is a humongous chunk of money that would help any community that has that project come to them. Again, Jamestown could be one of those communities that takes advantage of this new opportunity that's happening, but without that protection of that landmark ordinance, we don't know if we're going to continue to have this wonderful building stock that people can use for creative purposes. So again, that protection of investment. When it comes to negatives and how it might hurt Jamestown, I'm sorry, I don't see any negatives or how it would hurt Jamestown. There are things that don't work smoothly. There are things that don't happen the way that we want them to happen, but there is nothing that by passing this LPO would immediately hurt the city of Jamestown. There are literally thousands of communities in New York State that have local preservation ordinances, dozens of them here in Western New York. Those communities did not immediately self-destruct. They didn't die off. Developers and investors didn't immediately walk away and abandon their buildings or abandon new projects. Homeowners didn't stop buying buildings, especially when you look at the city of Buffalo, you look at some of this, especially in Marianne with East Aurora, you have people who are purposefully buying in those neighborhoods because they are local historic districts, because they have the protection of that LPO. So again, this idea that these predatory ideas from people who don't want to listen to somebody telling them what to do, and those big bad developer type people, all these old wives' tales are just not happening. We don't see that in the data. And then the other thing to keep in mind, in Clinton and a couple other people mentioned this as, again, like a hurtful, bad aspect of it. But again, I think there's not really going to be a negative impact on Jamestown. I think that where we have things that would be labeled as negative things is when it comes to that commitment and buy-in by the municipality. If there is not a serious commitment to support preservation, then it will not be successful. To support the work and continued training of the commission and the associated staff, but also to actively engage and educate the public. Again, 15 years of primarily advocacy side preservation work that I've been on. I've talked to hundreds of people who come up and say, I know everything about preservation. I've studied it for years. I don't like it. These are the reasons why I don't like it. And when you have the opportunity to sit with them and go through all of those reasons, you discover that they have been buying into those old wives' tales, that their understanding is not what actual modern preservation is. They have that misidea that it is about keeping things old-timey, that it is about prioritizing historic house museums and living in this fake world. And it's not, when in actuality, it is about shepherding us into the future. I think that, again, remembering that we have this wealth of architecture to landmark and designate, it's such variety to it. We want to continue that variety into the future. We don't want everything to stop looking nice and then just being glass blocks moving on. We want to continue this wealth and diversity of architecture. We can only do that by preserving that wealth that's already there, so we can learn and improve upon it moving into the future. And that is everything I have to say. Thank you.
Thanks, Christiana. All right, thanks everybody. I'm gonna actually open up the discussion, posing a question to you, Christiana, or anyone else that has, but you had kind of touched on this specifically, or anyone else that might have a way to distinguish or articulate these things. Because admittedly, I kind of echo the chorus of the benefits to Jamestown and the idea that there's not a downside to Jamestown. Where do you feel like the benefits to the community end and the benefits or the disadvantages to an individual begins? So where does the coin flip?
That's a very good question. I'm not exactly sure how to address this. I think I'm not exactly sure about whether or not there is a line in the sand. There is this coin to flip. I think that when we talk about those negative things that people might see as the negative impacts on them as a homeowner, having the government tell you what to do with your property and things like that, we have to just take a step back and a breath and understand that they already tell you what to do with your property, right? You already have rules and regulations about how you can handle and how you can use your property. So this is not some sort of brand new thing that is magically going to start happening when you have the LPO. You already have to follow rules about how you can handle your property. Also, again, I think it's important to understand that those rules and regulations of what you can and cannot do with your house once it's landmarked is not relayed accurately in this game of telephone in neighborhoods from property owner to property owner. Just recently, Clinton mentioned the Elmwood Historic District, the National Register District. We've been working with a community group here in the city to try to turn that into a local historic district. And we've been doing all of these community outreach, and all of these people who have very strong negative opinions and feelings about this, they start their story saying, well, I lived in this place and this is how it happened. Or my friend owned a house here and they had a landmark and this is what happened to them. Every community's landmark law is different. The way that they apply the standards of rehabilitation and the design guidelines that they create are completely different. So again, if you don't want the local preservation ordinance to do certain things and force you to do certain things, then you as a property owner need to be engaged and active in your community to make sure that that design guideline and that rules and procedures reflect how you want your community regulated. Mary brought up the painting of the exterior of the house. I personally am very much against regulating paint color. It is a purely cosmetic thing. Most preservation standards and guidelines agree with that. It is a cosmetic change. You can paint the house any day of the week, every day of the week. It is something that can easily be changed. There are communities out there that do regulate paint color because to them, that is very important to them. Communities like Newport, Rhode Island, other places out in like old in New England communities. Cape May, New Jersey has fabulously painted big, huge Victorian houses. They want to preserve those colors. So those communities regulate those little tiny things. Most regular communities don't regulate those things. So again, kind of being more honest and open and educated about what that other side of the coin might be for the property owner is much more important and helpful than trying to figure out that division of the benefits for the community versus the singular person. I hope that kind of addressed that.
Yeah, no, that's great. I invite any of our other roundtablers to kind of chime in if you have thoughts about the community versus the individual and kind of balancing those things and navigating the two sides of that coin.
Well, the question of the public good and the private rights was decided over 100 years ago when zoning was made legal by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has issued decision after decision, St. Bart's in New York City, where the public good of a regulated, healthy environment outweighs individuals every time it's been litigated. So it's almost, you try to get beyond people like that and go for the folks in the middle who are undecided, because every time you undertake a public policy initiative, there are going to be people who are automatically for what you're doing, people who are automatically against it, and you're always trying to help the middle come to consensus. We did that with the Jamestown train station. Greg, who was Tom, who headed the Gebby Foundation? Under his leadership, we conducted an open public forum where there was consensus that allowed the elected officials to say, yes, we should save the station. And that was brilliant leadership at the time. And it was effective because the consensus was we wanted to do the right thing for our community. And you can't get distracted by the people who are trying to derail the situation. I appreciate doubting Thomases because they make me perform at a higher level than I'd like to, but they do make one perform at a higher level. The other thing is the safety valve is the elected officials, because if they're ultimately hearing appeals to preservation board decisions, democracy is at work, and they are generally wiser and see the bigger picture better than they get credit for. And they know how hard preservation boards work to do the right thing. And this is an essential safety valve for democracy and the balance of public good and individual rights.
That's a really good point. And again, the idea that me, regular homeowner, how dare someone tell me what to do with my building, and that whole attitude. But without the LPO again, kind of using Buffalo as an example, without that protection of that LPO, then you actually have the opposite thing happening, where a different type of individual property owner is the one that gets their wishes and desires right. So, you know, like the regular homeowner doesn't want to be told what to do, but without that extra review and protection, you have these bigger picture developer and property owners who can do whatever they want, but then that will negatively impact them. So again, that understanding of everyone's on the same team and that it's the collective good protects your own investment as well. So, you know, you take on this extra permit that you have to file with the city, this extra one step you have to do with the city, but that prevents really negative, horrible things from happening in your neighborhood that would then negatively impact you. So like, you want everyone to be able to do what they want in the building, in their building, but at the same time, we need to have positive changes for everybody as well. I mean, that's another aspect of it too.
I think there's a great piece of wisdom I learned from Scott Whittam when he ran Historic Ithaca. Somebody said, Scott, what's the most important thing you do running Historic Ithaca? He said, I have a beer with the mayor at least once a month. So Dennis Galucki moved preservation into the Market Arcade building, putting preservation downtown in the center of the city. And he's an unsung hero in Buffalo, because I don't think most people understand how essential that was to put historic preservation at the center of the city, literally and figuratively. And of course, Preservation Buffalo Niagara's run with the ball ever since. But working with elected officials, keeping them informed, keeping them covered so they're not out on a limb, these are all important factors of a heritage conservation culture. Anthony Tung, in his book, writes about having a conservation culture. No city has demolished itself to success. But if there's a conservation culture, everybody benefits. And that's what you're embarking on. As Greg noted, the local preservation ordinance is one of the essential tools, and as Christiana has, one of the essential tools to implementing it.
Great, thank you. Jeff, did you want to chime in? I saw you took yourself off mute, so I didn't know if you had a question or a comment to contribute to that.
Well, I've been listening and really enjoying this conversation. And I think that everything that's being said is right on track, essentially, as to the way I look at things with regards to the city. The other thing, though, is with whether it's, you know, preservation of buildings or building new buildings or whatever, I think part of it has to be is that it's not the government that's, what I want to say, doing it, allowing it, and pushing it. It's really got to be something that's bought into by a good share of the population in the community. And that takes a lot of outreach to get it done. But one of the things that I've noticed in doing some things in the past, and even, well, years ago, I rehabilitated a school up in Sinclairville for elderly housing. And there was a lot of conversation that went on as to how it should be done and what's the end result going to be. You're using an old building and everything else. And it took a lot of meetings. I ended up with going there often to explain what things were that we were doing, taking the architect that I had working with me on that project up there to talk with people, talking with the county. But every time somebody in the community has a question, a concern, you've got to address it.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing that we've done with so much with regulations is kind of tell the people what it's going to be, and what you think about it is not important. If we do more to try to involve the public beforehand and have them actively involved in thinking about these things and looking at it from a more positive perspective, hopefully, it works out better. Jamestown, we've been working here for a long time and making changes. And years ago, I had the enjoyment of basically managing the Brooklyn Square Urban Renewal Project. which is one of these things where we're knocking down a lot of stuff and hoping and trying to plan as to what's coming forth in the future to go back into those spaces. And it's difficult, but it works better the more of the community, if you will, that's involved. You're never going to get 100%. You're going to get a bunch of people that are going to question things even after the answers have been given. You're going to have another bunch of people that are going to complain about it, even though they've heard some good reasons from others as to why it's good. But you got to deal with that. You need the community, you need the people, but that's where the tough sell really comes.
Absolutely.
And I agree with Clinton's comment about dealing with the peoples too. It can be difficult, but if you don't do it, you're going to undermine your own programming.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Let me kind of pose one last question for the group in terms of, again, kind of that coin flip in terms of where the economic components present barriers either for the community or the individual. Are there ways to navigate those things so the economic barriers of one or the other can somehow be, are there pathways to assuage that, outside of just a blanket policy or a blanket mechanism of how things operate or function?
The answer I have to that excellent question is that everything significant being built is being subsidized by somebody at this time in upstate New York. And so if your IDA adopts an adaptive reuse policy as part of its everyday operations, that is historic preservation. That's an incentive to attract new investment that doesn't make sense economically, because there's almost nowhere in upstate New York, except Chautauqua, maybe some of the Ellicottville, where you can put $5 into a building and be comfortable you'll have $5 5 years from now. So there is right now a subsidy culture, and it needs to be brought aboard a reinvestment. Another aspect of it is reinvesting in what you have is always more economical. We faced that, Jeffrey, with the first big school in upstate, Kibler School in Tonawanda, where the people who didn't understand low-income housing preferred stick-built greenfield projects because they were cheap and predictable and had a 5% contingency. So when we did Kibler School in Tonawanda, a massive 1920s school, we had to point out, you're not building a building as good as this for the seniors. You don't have the fire protection. You don't have the acoustic quality. You don't have the durability of materials, the generous corridors, the more exit stairs that are needed. So you're not comparing apples to apples. And by the way, we can bring this in for a 5% contingency, just like a new build. So Rick Lord, maybe none of you go back that far, Rick Lord at SHPO and I really worked over housing and community renewal, who said the highest and best use of a abandoned vacant school is as an abandoned vacant school. We're never putting seniors in old schools. Meanwhile, the seniors are saying, I want an apartment in this building I went to school in, because Greg, it took a woman mayor, Alice Roth, to realize she could keep her seniors in their neighborhoods, even if they couldn't afford to stay in their houses, because they'd be in Kibler School. So at the end, it turned out okay. It took 8 years, 8 major funding sources, a lot of political will, but it got an award from the Preservation League. So I called my friend at HCR and said, congratulations, you got an award for turning an abandoned former public school into state-of-the-art senior housing that's recognized statewide. He said, well, housing and community renewal, we've always been a community renewal agency. So, oh yeah, there we go. We turned them around. So this is a story of working with people and using the approach that you're getting a better end result with less money. if you reinvest in your existing stock than building new. That's almost always true across upstate New York because our market's so weak. And yet the need is so great to help people take care of their houses better. So the state historic tax credit, which we created with Governor Patterson, it's now 11 years old, was an economic acupunctural approach to neighborhood revitalization using local handy people, small scale projects. We purposely designed the program so you could fill out the forms as a homeowner and not need a professional. It was part of my hippie upbringing that we wanted to put power in the hands of people, and local districts don't do it, unfortunately. For the tax credit, they need to be both, the best protection is both local and National Register because you have access to the tax credits. But we purposely designed that program with Daniel McKay and Governor Patterson's people to make it accessible to people without experts, to put power in the neighborhoods to regenerate themselves from within. Jamestown's ready for that. You've had the big shiny object success that's absolutely essential with the Wellman building, the train station, so many other projects. Now's the time to take care of the underbrush and the rest of the urban ecology with the approach you're taking to a local preservation ordinance. I really urge you to have that discussion. As Jeffrey points out, it is a discussion and a candid one, and amongst gentle people. It doesn't need to be a fight or an argument. It's a conversation, listening to each other and understanding concerns and allaying the fears and moving forward.
One of the things I would like to mention, following on what you're saying, is that when we did the project in Sinclairville, that first one with the school, it was really kind of an interesting thing that I got drawn into because a friend who lived out there asked me to meet with some people in the community to talk about what they wanted to see done. And so I did. And it turned out, of all things, it was a bunch of elderly people that had formed what they called the Sinclairville 76ers for Better Living, Inc. And that was the driving force behind it. And even though I was becoming the developer, as well as the securities broker dealer that got the money together, hired the architects and all the rest of it, they were the ones that really got the community pumped up to do it. And the thing that I liked about it the most, and I wrote a writing about this and sent it out to all the limited partners that I had in the housing programs, but it was telling them what happened in Sinclairville, with it starting with the community, people in the community, growing to getting the project done. And that led to more investment in the downtown area, what it was called in Sinclairville, which is not really that large. New library came in out of the library system and all of those things. And every time when I go up there and just look around, I think, wow, what a change, because I can still remember back that 35 plus years ago when it was not anywhere near as nice as what it looks there now. It wasn't bad, but it was a farm community. But it really turned out great. And so it was exciting. The exciting part was, of course, it included doing the building and, you know, putting the project together, but it was working with the people that were so excited about trying to look for something to change their community. So I think a lot of times neighborhoods, if you have something that's going to be done on a historical credit or even something else to bring it up, people in a neighborhood get excited about it. If they're involved with it and happy with the outcome, you've accomplished a real plus. It's all about people more than it is buildings and regulations.
Thanks, Jeff. Over time. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Can I, just really quickly jump in on this? So, I mean, obviously, before you can even talk about the financial funding sources that might help with preservation work and keeping up your properties, I think we all have to just acknowledge that your home, your building, whatever building we're talking about, is going to be the largest investment that you make, right? It is the most expensive thing that you're going to buy. It's your largest piece of investment that you have, other than, you know, the thousands of dollars you might spend on your education and student loans. That's the most thing you're going to spend the most money on. Houses cost money to fix. So no matter what type of house you have, it's going to cost you money to fix it. So we have to understand, before we even talk about how much it would be to fix historic homes versus non-historic homes, all houses cost money to maintain. That just, and that cost of that maintenance and that repair work is directly related to the materials that you have, the condition of those materials, and what you want to take those materials to. It is not some magic wand that once you get landmarked, you're automatically cost more to fix that building. It's all about what your building is and where you want to take that. So just kind of demystifying and breaking down that kind of view that somehow automatically historic properties are going to be more expensive. Unfortunately, right off the bat, having an LOP does not automatically make some sort of big pot of money available to help people improve their properties, right? But as Clinton brought out and pointed out, there are lots of pots of money that Jamestown has already, that different authorities and agencies have access to and are dispensing. They are already giving easily piles of money to new development projects to help them afford these new things. And many of those same exact programs, with just a simple change in an ordinance or a resolution before the Common Council, or before the city or other agency, could change the rules of that program to allow that money to be used for rehabilitation and not just demolition and new construction. Very specific example, the city of Buffalo gets a pile of money from the community development block grant money. There's a big wide definition of what that money can be used for. When the city of Buffalo adopts that and accepts that money and puts into their budget what they're going to use for, they pass that line item saying they can only use it for demolition. So there is a pile of money that we in the city could be using to give homeowners low interest loans or grants to fix their house instead of demolishing it. But because of some little administrative thing, that money isn't accessible. So again, passing the ordinance doesn't mean that you're magically going to have this pot of money. But if the city and all of these different agencies and organizations actually look at the money they have available and make sure that that definition of who's eligible is as broad and open as it can, then there should not be issues with being able to find funding for different homeowners to get the money they need to do that work.
Great. Yeah, Clinton.
Well, Ellen, I don't know if we've answered Michelle's and Mike's and Greg's questions or comments.
I don't know either. So if they want to or sponge just taking all of
I
this
just
in,
had one
that's okay too. Yeah.
question. If I guess, should we differentiate between the commercial versus residential? Is there any benefits or to do that, or no?
But
No.
can you elaborate a little bit what distinction you see between the two?
Well, like, I guess right now we have a lot of commercial multi-story buildings in downtown, and a lot of the upper stories are vacant right now. So I didn't know if there's an approach to try to get them to maintain their historical value while also trying to open up the market to potential renters or other businesses who could utilize that space. And if
That's two different issues though, but that's two different issues. So there's the first question of evaluating and treating income producing properties and homeowner properties differently. And that's not something that preservation standards and guidelines would advise. Preservation laws and the ordinances themselves and the guidelines and standards that are used to implement that ordinance look at, it's not about what the use is. That's what zoning does. We are looking at the resource itself and the character defining features, its history, and how it's utilized, and using that information to make decisions for it going forward. So it doesn't matter if it's an income producing use or a homeowner owner occupant use. Those rules are applied equally. It's an egalitarian application of these zoning ordinances. Every resource is taken in the same. But that second part of your question about trying to encourage upper floor use and to get buildings occupied, that's a whole different program and different outreach opportunities that can happen. The Preservation League of New York State actually has like a whole program, and I can't remember the little nifty title they have for it, but there's actually proven, procedures and policies and recommendations of how to use local preservation ordinances and other regulations and programs to encourage and support these income producing property owners to occupy and get online those upper floors of those buildings. So those are very much two different questions and situations there.
Mike, if I might, there's a aspect of having a local district that causes developers to look more favorably on a project that's in a local district, particularly if they're going for tax credits. They're going to have the review of the appropriate alteration to the building anyway, if they're using historic tax credits. What a local district does is give them a context where someone will be monitoring what other property owners are doing. So one developer we worked with who grew up in a poor, seeing big developers put up big projects and the community not benefiting from them, has committed himself to have community benefits agreements as part of his development projects. Unfortunately, housing, or now called homes and community renewal, won't let him do that. But he's someone who grew up in a situation where there wasn't that protection of the community around an investment. Most developers want certainty. It's hard enough and uncertain enough to reinvest a lot of money, as you might have found, Jeff. You have to get a lot of consensus to bring certainty to attract investors, knowing they'll get their money back. And a local preservation ordinance will help that certainty more than a national register that makes them eligible for the state credits. Does that answer your question?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. From the developing end, I agree with everything he's saying. But I just got a call that dinner's on the table and I've got a break.
Very nice to see you. Thanks.
Time as well. Yeah.
Okay, but this has been
Thanks.
fun.
Thank you, Jeff. I appreciate your voice here at the table.
You're quite welcome.
End of that.
I enjoy participating.
Well, let me just kind of close things up then. That won't really close them up. We'll put it on pause. And so this is a comma, not a period. And hopefully, we can continue this conversation. Please feel welcome to reach out to me. I don't. Their voice here as well at the table.
Your dinner's being served.
No, right.
Thank you, everyone. Very pleased to meet you and see you again.
So I will be in touch and follow up with everyone, but thank you for attending this evening. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you. Thanks to all of you for a fun time.
Thanks, Jeff.
Nice to meet everyone.
You too, Marianne.
Have a good night.